Welcome to the Oh So Spurs podcast. Have you ever wondered how much FFP and PSR headroom Spurs have and what a big cash injection would do for them? What could they do with that money? Could they simply go and buy Mbappe? Would they build more hotels? How would they best leverage it? Well, we're going to answer all those questions for you. But we're first going to start with a quick, brief history lesson on who ENIC are and what has led us to this point as we hit a huge moment in their ownership. Well, as we know, they're a UK-based investment group, and currently Daniel Levy is the chairman of the group, but he's not the only shareholder. He's actually one of the minority shareholders. The Lewis family own the majority shares, and they actually have owned shares in multiple football clubs. Rangers, famously, they had a 25% stake in. AEK Athens, ENIC had a 47% stake in too, but they decided in the end to settle for Tottenham Hotspur. But why? Why did they buy us? What are they trying to do with us? Well, look, they invest in a business model whereby you buy assets, you grow them in value, and you sell them for a profit. And Spurs, in this case, are that asset. And we can talk about the benefits and the downsides of these models. Does it mean that you want to win things along the way? Or does it mean your only focus is finishing in league positions that generate more revenue? Well, that's going to be down to your opinion in the comments and listening right now. But they then went on to build the game-changing stadium in recent history, which has now seen Spurs in this position that we're going to discuss today, whereby we see ourselves as a potential powerhouse, but not necessarily with the cash in the pockets to leverage it. But Robbie, what have you made of it first from a fan's perspective following ENIC for this tenure? Do you think they've been positive for the club? Have there been things you've been particularly proud of they've done and things that you found particularly frustrating? Where does your head lie from a fan's perspective?
Well, I think it's a very tricky question to answer because I think they've done so many amazing things, and then there's also other things that it's very clear they could have done a lot better. But because they've been with the club for so long now, like 20, 24 years, I mean, it's a long time, and it's easy to forget when they took over, where we were, who we were competing with, like the likes of Everton and Villa, and even as the years went on, and it was going to be between us and Villa. I felt when the clubs were trying to break into that top four, who were outside of that established elite. And before they took over, we didn't really have much of a chance of certainly gaining ground on those guys from a financial standpoint and an infrastructure standpoint. I felt we were a club that were riding on our history a lot, and obviously a lot of people can say that perhaps we still are in many respects, but the stature of the club, I think, is indisputable, has increased massively under their stewardship. People used to mock our training academy as if it was like a prefab like shed, basically, and now it's world class. It's one of the best in the country, where suddenly it's a club people want to come to. I think perhaps we were always seen as a big club historically, but the infrastructure now, we've got some of the best facilities. It's one of the best stadiums to go and play your football. So perhaps without even the on-field success, we've somehow managed to establish ourselves as a club with genuine stature, which is something I think that should be commended that they've done. On the flip side, I mean, those 17 years we had to wait until glory this year felt like 17 years. It was hard at times. I remember just all those semi-finals and cup finals, those near misses, and whatever the reason is for falling short. But I just remember watching Chelsea, who essentially hit the cheat code with Abramovich, and just going like going out to them in the semi-final or the final, just feeling like, what's the point? What is the point of the sustainable approach? If this is allowed to happen, why should I have to put up with that? And I knew so many other fans felt that way, and lots actually have just gone, we should do it. We should get a Saudi investor, or an investor from wherever. Why not? Everyone else is doing it. No one else obeys the rules. Why should we? Why should we have to put up with this heartache? So I guess that's kind of, in a nutshell, my reflections on it.
It's been, yeah, I think it's a general sense of fantastic off the pitch, too many mistakes when it comes to on the pitch, I think is the very generalization would have of ENIC. But it has, whatever you think of them, led to a position where we now have £292 million in PSR headroom, the
Mm.
financial regulation we have to follow being an FA registered club. So that's a fantastic opportunity there for us. But that doesn't mean that you have £292 million to spend. So Spurs, as an example, we have turnover of 629 million. We made profit on players of 23 million, but we had costs of 408 million, and we owe a lot on transfer payables. So money we owe for footballers we've committed to buying in the next 12 months of 188 million. That only leaves 32 million pounds. Now, that doesn't buy many footballers. And someone will be saying, yeah, but you don't buy a footballer up front. No, you don't. That's very true. You do offset payments, but it still rules out players like Eze, who Crystal Palace want £50 million up front for. It still makes it hard for Spurs to leverage their position of power when it comes to regulations when they don't have the cash necessarily there. Now, I would caveat this with Spurs do have a £50 million credit facility with HSBC that they could draw down on if they felt it's right to do so. And because many clubs are happy to see loans with obligations to buy and these other models, Spurs can still be very aggressive in the transfer market if they want to. But I do think this is a good time to hand over to Luke, because what we'd like to know, Luke, is a lot of people get excited by the idea, and you've got an MBA in business administration. For those who are new to this playlist, I haven't met Luke before, but it's not quite. I think people expect if Spurs were bought tomorrow by someone with infinite pockets, you could enter the first game of the season and you'd have a front two of, Mbappe and someone else who's exceedingly expensive. But go on, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, so if we did have a Saudi investor or just an infinite money cheat code, obviously the first thing is that yes, Spurs would be able to spend up to that 292 million pound PSR limit. That's a limit. That's as much as we could spend even if we had billions to throw around. That's the most we would be able to spend from a PSR standpoint. Now, that doesn't mean we couldn't buy other things or do other things with that money. It's just we would be limited to that 292 million for things like player transfers. So things that are not subject to the PSR limits would be capital investments. That would be improvements to the stadium, improvements to the training ground, a hotel, that sort of thing. Right now, we don't have a lot of need for any of that. We have the best stadium in England still, and there's not really any need or benefit to spending to improve that further and try to increase our lead in that direction. We have the hotel project that is apparently moving along. We have top training facilities, that sort of thing. So, really, the most obvious use for infinite money would be to pay off any debts that we have. We still have somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 900 million pounds in debts related to the stadium. And again, with infinite money, you just wave a magic wand and say, that's done now. And the benefit to doing that, of course, is that we no longer have to make interest payments. So, what that would do is that would free up about 30 million pounds in interest that we owe on those loans for the stadium. And that 30 million would be new cash flow that we could spend on the actual business of football. I don't think it makes any difference to our actual PSR limit, but it does, it means we don't have to dip further into the infinite cash pile, which, whoever brings that, I'm sure would appreciate. I also not sure what we would be able to do. Jim, you mentioned the money that we owe on the player transfers. And I don't know if it's as simple as paying those off early, but I think you would have to go and kind of almost renegotiate those transfers that we owe on to say, hey, are we okay to pay this off early? You wouldn't expect too many clubs to mind being paid early, but who knows? There may be some technicalities or some things tied up in all of those. So it would be a little bit more complicated, but I think not impossible, especially with infinite money. So yeah, I mean that's really the big one, is just kind of paying down the debt and then spending on any other kind of capital improvements that would increase our cash flow and raise that PSR limit for us.
Mm. But the headroom, like we said, that's not the problem, really, is it? It's that because that £292 million in headroom is again going to be helped next season as the depreciation of the stadium continues as another cost, a huge one that we can offset every year as our stadium is newer and more expensive. We write off that depreciating value against our profits, and that allows us to circumnavigate even more than most clubs could. So it does feel like the right time to try and to be leverage a big cash pile, because as time goes on, those depreciation figures may change, and Spurs may not be able to leverage that as
And
heavily.
funny you bring that up, because I think the depreciation that we've taken on the stadium has actually we've actually changed how we calculate that depreciation. And I've said this before, and I'll say this a million times. There's a reason that accounting is kind of its own separate discipline. But the long and short of it, if I can make it short, is that there are different ways to calculate depreciation. You can simply do what's called straight line depreciation, where you just say, listen, it's 15 million every year until the stadium is, until we've depreciated the full value of the stadium. You can also kind of treat it more like a car is a good example, right? Most of the value of that car is depreciated in the first 2 years. So you can kind of almost do it like an L-shaped curve, where in that first couple of years, you're actually writing down more of the asset, and then the amount of depreciation slowly tapers off over the remaining 3 years if you're doing a 5-year depreciation. So we've changed that once, as I understand it. I don't know if it makes good sense to continue changing that depreciation, but the upshot is that there is an upper limit to the depreciation that we can charge on that stadium. We can't ever charge more in depreciation than we spent to build the thing.
Mm-hmm. So it does change some things. It gives us the ability to do a few things, but there's still, when you consider that we've got a £292 million headroom and we've averaged a net spend of around 122 million per season since Stadium opened in terms of net spend, it does imply that we could accelerate that spending and look at the wage side as well and raise that ratio without having to worry as much about the implications. But Gav, our brilliant business journalist, part of the show, we'll hand over to you to explain a little bit about what else that cash could be used for.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of the things that have been touched on there. Kind of the immediate wins, paying down the debt was mentioned, and that falls into the one of two categories. So different things you do with the money if you had someone just stuck £2 billion into the bank account at Spurs. You've got the things that can help to make the business effectively more efficient, the things that enable you to spend more of the revenue that you're already generating, and you've got the things that would enable you to have more revenue and therefore be able to spend more. Getting rid of the debt gives that £30 million of interest every year back, so that's more of the existing revenue you could spend. And you mentioned briefly as well there, we often are probably buying players on account because we don't necessarily have the cash up front. Now, the reality of most negotiations are that if we value a player at £50 million and the selling team values them at £50 million, that seems like a really easy deal if you've got £50 million in the bank. If you haven't, and you've only got £20 million and you want to pay £15 million in the following 2 years to make it up to £50 million, the chances are that club will say no, then it's £60 million because they're not getting the cash. There's an additional risk. Also, most clubs are focused somewhat on their cash flow as well. So by not having cash in the bank, we're probably paying more for players than we would otherwise be paying. And so there's an opportunity if you've got the 2 billion in the bank, even after paying off 800 million pounds worth of debt. If you've still got more cash in the bank because you've got an infinite cash owner and they've put loads of money in, well, out of say a 200 million pounds a year transfer spend, even if that just saves you about 10% in total transfer fees because you're able to pay up front rather than constantly paying a bit more in order to have it staggered over a couple of years, that's £20 million a year that you can then respend every year. And that's basically a Kevin Danso every year that you can afford in transfer fees, in the same way that the £30 million of debt interest being paid off is effectively a Kulusevski every year that Tottenham Hotspur would have the cash to buy. So there's those things that an infinite cash owner could do. Just simply putting cash into the business would mean that without raising revenue in any way, it would simply be more efficient to run Tottenham Hotspur. We would have fewer costs, or we would be able to buy things cheaper. That would be really useful. Then there's the other stuff, which is about raising the revenue ceiling for the club. And these fit into sort of two broad categories. One category is the loads of money right now, but people will probably question whether it's within the rules. And then there's the long-term process that is effectively what Spurs have spent years doing, just not with infinite cash. So the loads of money right now, if you've got an infinite cash owner, they can buy up 10 companies doing all kinds of different things. It could be anything. They can make tractors. It really doesn't matter. And then each of those 10 companies could sponsor something about Spurs for £10 million a year each. Spurs revenue has gone up by £100 million, which is a whole load of money under UEFA's squad cost ratios. That's another £70 million a year to be spent on players, which on an amortised basis would be, I think I get this right, £350 million of transfer fees that we could pay out on the back of that. It would be entirely against the spirit of all of the kinds of rules that have been set up that are there to ensure sustainability of the club. Because if that infinite cash buyer disappears for some reason, they die or they just lose interest, they decide, actually, do you know what, there's more glory in table tennis from now on, so I'm going to go and do that. Those sponsorships would disappear as well. There's nothing lasting about that for Spurs. It disappears. And the day that disappears, Spurs have got a whole load of cost in the business and a massive drop in revenue. And that's the kind of situation that the rules are there to stop from happening. The much bigger stuff is the stuff that Tottenham are already doing, but without infinite cash, and that some infinite cash buyers are doing, and we see this with Manchester City, which is the much longer term approach of building up assets. We've already built the stadium, so on that front, we're not going to do probably what Manchester City are presently in the process of doing, which is expanding their stadium to get more people in to raise their revenue further. But around their stadium, they are building retail facilities, hotels, and all of that kind of thing, because long term that raises their revenue and gives them another area of cash coming into the business. And if you're an infinite cash buyer, although it will take a few years for that to pay off, because you've got to go through planning processes, you've got to get all designed, you've got to get those things built, then you've got to get them up and running. There's nothing, if you've got an infinite cash pot, to stop you building the hotel that Spurs are building with no debt required, so there'll be no interest that follows, to build a casino, to build a retail park, to buy up more land around the ground and build more stuff that builds up a complex around the stadium, which we already partly have done, just taking a very, very long time. It's taken, as mentioned earlier, ENIC have probably spent about 20 years in some form or another developing plans and then eventually delivering the stadium. The school academy, which is just separate to the training academy, where there's kids at school at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. You've got the supermarket, you've got the hotel coming, you've got all kinds of things that are being developed to create that complex. The biggest, and definitely within all of the value of the PSR rules, within the spirit of the PSR rules, building all of that stuff lasts. The process by which it is all built, it is all within the club, it is all part of the business. The infinite cash owner leaves, it's still Tottenham Hotspur, so we still get that revenue. The hotel money keeps coming in. So you've got those kinds of paths. There is the other slightly cheeky path if you really want to go into breaking the rules without breaking the rules, but do it in a way that almost everyone will feel pretty horrendous about Spurs doing it. What you do is you go and buy a bunch of other football clubs.
I was going to bring this one up because Man City, for example, have 17 football clubs, City Group.
Wow.
Football teams. And some of them are the same club because they can actually, you can bend the rules a bit there, can't you? But anyway, sorry, let you carry on.
No, you're absolutely right. It is, Manchester City have 17 football clubs around the world. It is, from a football point of view, an utterly immoral concept that football clubs can own other football clubs or will be owned by the same people. And we are seeing with the turmoil at Crystal Palace right now that there are implications to it that are rightly in place, but ultimately there should just be a rule against it. But there isn't. And it's great that there isn't if you're an infinite cash owner, because you just go and buy a bunch of football clubs. And by buying a bunch of football clubs, what you've then got is a whole bunch of youth academies and a whole bunch of scouting networks all around the world without your one club that you actually care about having to pay for all of that. Because you can just dump that cost on those other clubs. They'll do it for you, and it doesn't affect your PSR position at all.
Because the thing that goes unnoticed often is like City Football Group lose over 100 million a year. Now, for someone like ENIC or most owners in the Premier League, to swallow over 100 million pounds a year in losses because your benefit of you owning that football club is not related to ever, making that profit in the short term or medium term. Now, once again, what your morals are is, we're not here to project opinions on that. That's your opinions and stuff. But, you're hard pressed to find a squeaky clean, very wealthy billionaire owning a football club. They've all got different motives. Some people are to make money and some people's motives are different to other things. But City Groups is not short-term profit. And as a result, there's all these football clubs on that umbrella. And like you said, Gav, over 10 scouting networks around the world, over 10 youth academies, over 10 clubs of different sets of coaches. And people say, oh, well, they don't move someone from Palmero to Girona, to Man City. But they still have all their scouts in Spain telling them who they should buy, coming from other academies or wherever else. It's an enormous advantage to be able to swallow £1 billion and buy a lot over 10 years. I think they lost over £1 billion and be able to run a model like that. So that's something Spurs could do, right? Just look at art the possible, not looking at opinions of what they should do and morals and all those things. Spurs wanted to supercharge the football club and just focus purely on nothing but winning trophies. They could go out and buy 20 football clubs, 20 scouting networks, build tons more hotels, build another stadium attached to Spurs just for the fun of it, and just chuck a few people in there watching on the big screens, stuff it. Let's build a go-kart track over London. They could do all these things that would accelerate their ability to navigate these rules even more. And that is not even touching on the sponsorships you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I will correct you on something. Manchester City do take players from their other clubs. There have been instances. So a couple of years ago, I think they own a club in France. They bought one of their players. Now, technically, there's literally nothing in the rules to say that that's wrong. And arguably, they would say they paid a fair market price for a player that many fans looked at it and thought that was cheap. Our team should have gone and bought them, slightly overlooking that it was a Manchester City club selling to Manchester City. So unlikely another club would have been able to buy that player. But at the same time, in theory, if they want, because there is an allowable loss system, Manchester City can only lose their roughly £100 million every 3 years. If you imagine a whole bunch of other clubs with that £100 million-ish pounds of loss allowance over 3 years, or whatever the different rules are in different jurisdictions, if you want to sell players a bit cheap to Manchester City because they own you, that would be fine. So, Tottenham Hotspur's point of view, if we own a club and they've got a player who's probably worth £50 million, but we can buy him for £20 million, and it doesn't really matter that that club's going to run up a bit of their loss because they've got an allowance on their accounts under their PSR rules in whatever country that they're in, and so they've got the allowance to be able to lose money. And if we are stretching the amount we are allowed to lose money, we can just do it that way. We can basically borrow their loss allowance in order to supplement the way we run our club, which is, as I say, it's one of the most immoral prospects of an infinite cash owner. But it's being done by numerous people and owners at the moment.
Yeah, well, Scott Munn was a part of Manchester City's multi-club ownership model, wasn't he? He was CEO for a different region. But there's also there's the Chelsea model as well, where you can start doing even more circumnavigation of the rules. Technically, Spurs could buy their own women's team for £1 billion, or they could buy their own hotel back off themselves for £1 billion, and they just keep navigating these rules. So there are lots of ways Spurs could use that money to basically, if there was a fictional scenario where they had billions and billions come in, but they would still, for a lot of these, still be capped by that PSR headroom. But there are too many holes to truly kind of block out the potential of what that investment could do in the long term. I would say the short term, there are a lot of limitations over what you can do, as we're seeing of Newcastle as an example. There a lot of things they could do long term. They're not quite investing in it. Sorry, Robbie.
No, I was going to say on a short term question. I'm not sure if anyone's done the maths or would be able to do it quickly, but I wouldn't put it past some of the guys here to have figured it out already. But on that, our PSR headroom, if we suddenly had an infinite cash buyer tomorrow, and they just spent what it was 290 for this year, how would that impact us for next year? What would we be able to spend? And then the next year, would it? I'm imagining it would diminish what we could then spend unless we were to do some of the, above board trickery or below board trickery. Because say, for example, for ENIC, let's say, raise the money and just go, right, we're just going to spend the 290 this year. How does that affect us next year is I guess the question, if anyone knows.
It's a good question. I can have a stab not so much at Spurs as from a specific point of view, but I can set out the concept of how that works, which is that if you're allowed to lose 100 million, roughly, over the course of 3 years, if you make all of that loss in 1 year, then at some point that year is the third year back and you've had 2 years since. And in those 2 years since, you will have to have balanced the books.
Right.
Because you've still already done your 100. So if you were to try to play it in a way that you were spending your allowable loss and maxing out your allowable loss, the smart way to do it would be to spend at a rate of about a £35 million a year loss.
But
If you're
this is
losing
what
that every year, then 35 million drops off, another 35 million comes on, and then you're always at the limit, and that would be the stable
but this is
way
what's
to run that loss.
this is what's happened to Chelsea and happened to Villa is they've spent projecting Champions League revenue that didn't arrive, and they can't balance the books on those second and third years. So then, in Chelsea's case, it's quick sell ourselves something, an asset. How can we balance the books in this next quarter? I don't think they'd ever planned on that being Plan A.
Yeah,
but they had the Plan B and they've Plan C, and let's see that. I think we're going to see clubs come up with even more ways that we go. Finally, we caught that cheeky billionaire Todd out. We got him this time. We followed the rules, and they'll come up with something. We go, that's allowed. Well, it's not in the rule book, so it's a deep rabbit hole.
So, Gav, you mentioned if we were to spend the 292 million in PSR headroom in a single year, like you said, we'd have to balance that back to zero by the end of year 3. So you're looking at having to make a profit of 150 million. And again, that's 150 million 1 year and then the next year. So all we would have to do is sell Harry Kane or so twice a year for the next 2 years. And how hard can that be?
Very good. Yeah. So I think I came into this expecting, so if there's an infinite cache of money, I didn't think we'd be able to do as much as I've realised we probably can do, actually, if that money was there. And it really is one of those things where it's a personal thing for your views in football. Do you want your club to go down that path, or do you feel you prefer a model that Spurs are in now, which is, I think the term often uses organic, whereby you are relying on the rules and your own revenue and your own means, and your owners aren't withdrawing the cash during that process, but they're looking at it at some point to sell and make a profit on. I think you'd find that as the organic model. Then you've got the Man United, which is organic, but we take lots of money out in dividends, and we don't really care what mess we leave behind for the fans. That's not why we're here. Or you get the kind of Chelseas and the Cities, which are, we don't go into politics on here, but they're, well, City in particular, they're not in it for any short-term profiteering from a financial perspective. And it's whether you feel comfortable with your club being a part of that or not. But yeah, cash is pretty king in football, right? So yeah. Anyway, we'll be back with many more exciting financial related episodes and Spurs and numbers related episodes around our squad. So come on, you Spurs.
Go on, you Spurs.